The knife meant for roots found its true purpose in a man's neck. By morning, he was dead. She was alive. But surviving meant betrayal, and her own people had condemned her to death. Hunted and alone, she knelt on a stranger's porch, a wealthy, cold-hearted rancher, and made an offer no man could refuse. How did a desperate act of survival lead to such an impossible bargain? If you crave stories of fierce determination and unexpected turns, comment 1 to go back in time with us. To understand how a desperate act led to an impossible love, we must go back to the dusty, unforgiving lands of the Wyoming Territory in 1878. The memory was a fresh, throbbing bruise beneath Annaba's skin. It began with the stench of stale corn beer and the heavy, ragged breathing of a respected warrior twice her age. He had cornered her near the communal fire, his eyes glazed with an intent that curdled her blood. His hand, calloused from years of gripping a bough, had snaked out, fumbling with the ties of her deerskin dress. Fear, sharp and cold, had sliced through her. She had fought, her young body surprisingly strong, her nails raking his face. But he was larger, heavier, his grunts less human than animal. In one frantic, desperate thrust, her hand had closed around a discarded flint knife, and she had buried it deep in his neck. The tribe, her own people, had gathered, their faces etched with a judgment colder than any winter wind. Her plea of self-defense was dismissed. He was a provider. She was just a girl. The verdict had been swift, brutal, death. That night, her mother had come to her, a ghost in the darkness. "Run," she had whispered. "Run now and do not look back." Live. And so, Annaba ran. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs threatened to give out, until the familiar landscape of her tribal lands blurred into an indistinguishable expanse of mud and trees. A furious storm lashed at her, soaking her clothes, plastering her dark hair to her face. She ran west, guided by a whispered rumor of a solitary white man's ranch, a place far from any settlement, nestled deep within the unforgiving plains. As the last vestiges of daylight bled into a bruised twilight, a faint light flickered in the distance, a phantom ship on a dark sea. It was the Granite Peak Ranch, a sprawling, well-kept homestead built on cattle and land, a testament to the formidable wealth of its owner, Isaac Thorne. He was a man known to be as cold and unyielding as the granite peaks that rimmed his distant horizon. A widower, his wife Clara having succumbed to a fever years ago, he had retreated into a life of stark, desolate solitude. Rumors painted him as an enigma, a man who had amassed a fortune but found no joy, whose eyes held the emptiness of a forgotten grave. Annaba stumbled towards the house, her body screaming in protest, every muscle a knot of agony. The rain had turned her into a shivering, mud-streaked specter. The light from a single window beckoned, a beacon of desperate hope. She reached the porch, her hand trembling as she raised it to knock. The wood felt rough and solid beneath her knuckles. A long, heart-pounding moment passed. Then, the door creaked open. Isaac Thorne stood framed in the doorway, his silhouette imposing against the warm glow of the lamp behind him. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a stern, angular face that seemed carved from stone. His eyes, though shadowed by the dim light, held a piercing, assessing intensity. He wore a simple flannel shirt, his dark hair slightly disheveled. A flicker of surprise, quickly masked, crossed his features as he took in the sight of the young Apache woman, drenched and trembling on his doorstep. The fortress of his solitude had been breached. Annaba's voice, when it finally emerged, was a raw, desperate croak, barely audible above the howling wind. Her pride, a thing once so fiercely guarded, shattered into a million pieces at her feet. She knelt, the cold, wet wood biting into her knees, her eyes fixed on his boots. "Please," she choked out, the word thick with unshed tears. "I beg you, let me stay." Her gaze lifted, imploring, vulnerable, a raw plea from a soul on the brink of annihilation. "I'll do whatever you want. I can clean, cook. You can use me however you wish. I can even give you an heir, if it is your will." The words hung in the air, shocking in their starkness, their raw desperation. She had offered him everything she had left, her body, her future, her very self. It was a gamble, a desperate, last-ditch effort to survive. And as she looked up at the cold, unreadable face of the man who held her fate in his hands, she could only pray that it was enough. Isaac's expression remained unreadable, a carefully constructed mask of disinterest. He studied her, his gaze unwavering, assessing the desperate plea, the shattered dignity in her eyes. His housekeeper, a reliable woman from a nearby settlement, had left unexpectedly a week ago, called away by a family emergency. He had been managing alone, but the sprawling ranch house, a place he had built for a life that no longer existed, was a constant, demanding presence. The thought of finding new help in this isolated corner of the world was a persistent irritation. And now this, an Apache girl, clearly on the run, offering herself in such a startling, desperate manner. A pragmatic corner of his mind, the part of him that had built an empire on shrewd decisions and calculated risks, recognized a temporary solution to his domestic woes. She was a problem, yes, but a problem that could also be a solution, at least until the storm passed, and he could send a rider to Redemption Gulch for proper, less complicated help. He finally spoke, his voice low and devoid of any warmth, a sound as cold and as hard as the granite peaks that gave his ranch its name. "Get up," he commanded, his eyes still assessing her, calculating. "You're soaked to the bone." He stepped back, a silent, grudging invitation. The warmth of the house was a sudden, blissful shock against her chilled skin. "You can stay," he continued, his tone flat, transactional, "until the storm breaks. Then we will discuss what happens next. Do you understand?" Annabeth nodded, unable to speak, the relief so profound it threatened to buckle her knees. She was inside. She was safe. For now. But the uncertainty of his words, the coldness in his eyes, left a lingering chill that no fire could entirely dispel. The future, a vast, unknown expanse, stretched before her, tethered to the will of this enigmatic, solitary man. She had bought herself a temporary reprieve, but she knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in her gut, that the price for her survival had yet to be determined. The first few days at the Granite Peak Ranch were a quiet testament to Annabeth's resilience. Isaac had made his position clear. She was a temporary fixture, a necessary inconvenience, a debt to be repaid for the shelter he had offered. He had given her a small, sparse room, a cot, and the promise of a safe passage once the immediate threat of the storm, and of whatever she was running from, had subsided. There was no warmth in his voice, no welcoming gesture. He saw her as a problem to be managed, a responsibility reluctantly assumed. His instructions were curt, his gaze averted. "Do what you need to do," he had grunted, gesturing vaguely towards the main house before retreating to the solitude of his study or the vast, empty expanse of his fields. He expected her to keep to herself, to be unseen, unheard, a ghost in the shell of his empty life. And for a time, she was. She moved with a purpose that belied her slender frame, her steps light, almost soundless. The dust, thick and ancient, began to yield. The sun, once diffused by grime, now streamed through cleaner panes, illuminating the faded grandeur of the house. Isaac, returning from the fields, would find a room subtly transformed. The parlor, which had been a mausoleum for his wife Clara's memory, now felt merely quiet, not dead. He wouldn't acknowledge it aloud, not even to himself, but the air felt lighter, less oppressive. On the third evening, the scent of wood smoke mingled with something else, something rich and savory, wafting from the kitchen. He found her stirring a pot over a crackling fire, the air thick with the aroma of stewed meat and wild herbs. She turned, her dark eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment before she looked away. The meal, a simple beef stew with fresh-baked bread, was unlike anything he had eaten in years. It wasn't just the taste, it was the warmth, the feeling of nourishment that spread through him, chasing away a gnawing emptiness he hadn't even realized had taken root so deeply. He had offered her a roof, a temporary shelter, but she, without knowing it, without even trying, had begun to rebuild the walls of his own heart, one quiet, unassuming act of care at a time. The cold, calculating rancher who had seen her as a temporary solution was beginning to see something else, something he had thought he had buried forever, the possibility of a home. If you have ever experienced a moment of unexpected kindness that changed everything, a small gesture that brought light into your darkest hour, please share this story. Let's celebrate the quiet, unassuming power of a compassionate heart. As twilight bled across the western sky, painting the ranch in hues of orange and purple, Isaac stood on the porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The day was done, the chores completed, the house warm with the lingering scent of wood smoke and Annaba's cooking. He had expected her to be a temporary inconvenience, a fleeting shadow that would disappear with the setting sun. But she was still here, a quiet, vibrant presence that had taken root in the desolate landscape of his life. The thought of her departure, once a certainty, now settled upon him with an unexpected weight. It was no longer a matter of convenience, but a prospect that disturbed him, stirring a quiet unease in the depths of his being. The ranch, his life, had begun to transform, not by grand gestures, but by the subtle, persistent presence of a young woman he had initially dismissed as nothing more than a temporary employee. He was no longer merely observing her. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, and in doing so, he was beginning to see himself, and the possibility of a future he had thought had vanished forever. The ranch, once a silent sanctuary for Isaac, began to vibrate with a new cadence. It wasn't noise, but a subtle melody woven by Annaba's light footsteps, the whisper of her movements, the smell of the herbs she used to season their meals. With each passing day, the strangeness between them dissolved like morning mist under the desert sun. Isaac found himself watching her more than he should. The way the sunlight painted golden reflections in her dark hair, the way her curious eyes fixed on every detail of the ranch as he explained the cycles of planting, the need for rain, the language of the cattle. Things he hadn't shared with anyone since Clara. There was a genuine curiosity in Annaba, a thirst for learning that disarmed his usual reticence. She, in turn, seemed to find a strange comfort in his presence, in his quietness, and the tacit protection he offered. A mutual respect blossomed into something warmer, something more dangerous. An accidental touch across the dinner table, a gaze held a moment too long, the palpable tension that filled every room they shared. The nights were particularly charged. The heat of the fireplace seemed to amplify the unspoken heat between them. One night, after a long, tiring day, as they sat on the porch under a canopy of stars, Isaac noticed Annaba shiver in the cool night air. Without thinking, he draped a heavy wool blanket over her shoulders, his fingers brushing her arm. The touch was brief, but the current that passed between them was undeniable, a jolt of awareness that left them both breathless. The silence of the house, once a reflection of his own desolate solitude, was no longer empty. It was filled, not with noise, but with the subtle hum of her presence, the gentle rhythm of her breathing, the unspoken story in her quiet diligence. He would catch himself listening for her, for the faint sounds that indicated she was near, a strange, unfamiliar warmth unfurling within him, a sensation he hadn't felt in a decade. It was a blend of comfort, of an unexpected sense of hope, and something else, something primal and undeniable, desire. It was a disconcerting awakening in a heart he believed had long since turned to stone. He had buried such feelings deep, convinced they had died with Clara. But Annaba's quiet presence, her steady, unassuming grace, was unearthing them, one hesitant, heart-pounding beat at a time. The touches, once accidental, became more deliberate, more intentional. A stolen kiss in the shadow of the kitchen door, a hug that lingered too long in the living room, their bodies finding a comfort and a passion that was both tender and intense. While a fragile peace settled over the Granite Peak Ranch, the nearby town of Redemption Gulch was buzzing. Rumors are like fire in dry fields, and the news of a young Apache woman living under the roof of the reclusive Isaac Thorne was potent fuel. The whispers began in the saloons, in the church pews, in the aisles of the general store. He's lost his mind. A savage in his house. What would Clara think? The malicious gossip and baseless speculation spread quickly, a poison that seeped into the very foundations of the community. Isaac's reputation, once untouchable due to his wealth and his reclusiveness, was now under the town's harsh, unforgiving microscope. The storm he had sought to escape was gathering on his doorstep, and it was about to break. The tension reached its breaking point on a sunny afternoon when a familiar carriage stopped in front of the main house. Isaac, inspecting the barn, saw the slim, elegant figure of his late wife's sister step down. Her thin lips were pressed into a hard line, and her eyes, so reminiscent of Clara's, carried an intensity that he knew well. She was the embodiment of respectability and social convention in Redemption Gulch, a woman whose judgment was as swift and as unforgiving as a winter storm. Annabeth, who was gathering firewood near the house, saw the carriage and the woman's grim, disapproving face. A chill ran down her spine. She hid behind a stack of logs, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and watched the scene unfold. "Isaac, what is the meaning of this?" the sister-in-law demanded, her voice full of indignation as he approached. "I heard the rumors in town, but I refuse to believe them. A native in this house? Have you lost your mind?" Isaac sighed, his face hardening into a familiar mask of cold indifference. "This is none of your business. She is a refugee. I am helping her." "Refugee?" his sister-in-law scoffed, crossing her arms. "Are you so naive? She is living under your roof. Isaac, do you have any idea what people are saying? You are dragging Clara's reputation through the mud." Her eyes sparked with a righteous fury. "She is a threat to decency, Isaac. She represents barbarism, disorder. She has no place here, in this home, on this ranch that Clara loved so dearly." She gestured with her hands, each word a blow. "You need to send her away, for your own good, for Clara's memory." Hidden, Annabeth felt each of her words like a lash. The pain of judgment, the relentless cruelty of someone who didn't even know her, was a familiar, sickening ache. The raw truth of her precarious situation hit her with a crushing force. She was causing trouble for Isaac. Her presence, which had once seemed like a refuge, was now a stain, a scandal, a source of pain for the one person who had shown her kindness. She backed away silently and ran to her room, the sister-in-law's words echoing in her mind. "Savage. Barbarism. No place here." She sat on the edge of her cot, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the wall, seeing only the precipice of her situation. The fragile hope ignited by Isaac's kindness was gone, replaced by a cold, resigned despair. She was a burden. Outside, Isaac stood silent for a long moment after his sister-in-law's outburst. He felt the weight of truth in her words, the danger that Annabeth's presence posed to his reputation, to his isolated way of life. But at the same time, he felt an overwhelming, unfamiliar urge to protect her, to shield her from the judgment of the world, from the prejudice of people like his sister-in-law. The desire to keep her by his side, not to lose her, collided violently with the need to preserve what was left of his carefully constructed life. He was trapped between two worlds, the world he had built to honor the memory of his dead wife, and the world he was beginning to imagine with the living, breathing woman who had brought his house and his heart back to life. The abyss between them was widening, and he was being forced to choose a side. The echo of their argument resonated through the silent house. Annabeth, curled up in her small room, felt the sister-in-law's accusations pierce the fragile veil of her hope. With a painful determination, she stood and began to fold the few simple dresses Isaac had bought for her, placing them carefully on the bed. The decision was made. She would leave before dawn, slipping away as quietly as she had arrived. It was the only way to relieve the burden she had become, the only way to repay the kindness he had shown her, even if it meant tearing her own heart in two. Outside, the sister-in-law's voice finally fell silent. Isaac walked her to her carriage, the air between them still heavy with unspoken anger. He watched her ride off, her figure dissolving into the darkness of the Wyoming night. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was a deafening, terrifying emptiness. The image of Annabeth, so fragile and yet so strong, filled his thoughts. The quiet she had brought to his home, the way her curious, gentle eyes watched him, the resilience in every fiber of her being. He had offered her a roof, a temporary shelter, but she, without knowing it, had begun to rebuild the walls of his own heart. The idea that she might leave, that the quiet and the unexpected sense of home she carried might simply disappear, sent a cold wave of panic through his veins. If you were Isaac, a man caught between the judgment of society and the call of his own heart, what would you do? How would you fight for a love that the world has deemed unacceptable? Share your thoughts and your own stories of defiance in the comments below. It was no longer just about an heir, about the promise of a future for his name. It was about the present, about the life he had started to imagine at her side, a life no longer defined by loss and isolation. He had to find her. He had to know if the venom of his sister-in-law's words had reached her. He walked toward Annaba's room, the sound of his own footsteps echoing heavily through the wooden hallway. The door was ajar. He pushed it open gently, and the scene that unfolded struck him like a physical blow. Annaba was facing away from him, methodically folding the few clothes he had given her, arranging them in a neat pile that screamed her intent to leave. The dim light from the lamp cast dancing shadows across her tense shoulders. An overwhelming desperation, a feeling he had not experienced in years, took hold of him. All his self-control, the armor he had built to protect his heart, crumbled in an instant. The sight of her, so small and vulnerable, ready to face the world alone again because of him, broke something deep inside. "Annaba," he called, his voice a raw, unrecognizable croak. She turned abruptly, her eyes wide with surprise and, for a moment, fear. But seeing the desperation on his face, her expression softened, though the sadness still lingered. "Isaac," she whispered, her hand resting on the folded clothes. "I heard your sister-in-law. She's right. I've become a burden to you." Her voice trembled with a quiet, resigned finality. "You won't have to worry anymore." Her words, filled with a self-sacrificing dignity, were the final straw. The fear of losing her, of seeing her disappear back into the vast, dangerous frontier, overcame any pride or hesitation he still held. For the first time in his adult life, Isaac Thorne, the cold, isolated man who had sworn never to open himself to the pain of love again, fell to his knees. It was not a gesture of begging, but one of such profound vulnerability that it shocked him as much as it did her. He lifted his eyes to her, his own filled with a grief and a terror she had never seen before. "No," he pleaded, his voice choked with a raw, desperate emotion. "No, Annaba, please don't go." He reached a hand toward her, hesitant, trembling. "Stay," he whispered. "Work here if you want. Live here with me." He took a deep, shuddering breath, the words pouring out in a desperate, unfiltered rush of sincerity. "And if you still want to give me a child, let it be for love, not out of debt." The words hung in the air, charged with an overwhelming, undeniable truth. Annaba looked at him in shock. The man before her was not the distant, reserved rancher she had known, but a man who had laid his soul bare, a man begging her to stay. The mask of control had fallen, revealing a heart that, like hers, had been scarred by loss, but which now offered a promise of healing. A wave of warmth and relief flooded through her, chasing away the cold, creeping despair. Her own tears began to fall, silent and hot. She knelt before him, her hands reaching out to touch his face, to feel the roughness of his beard, the wetness of his tears. "Yes," she whispered, her voice broken by emotion. "Yes, Isaac. I'll stay. I want to stay." In a movement that felt both slow and urgent, he leaned in, and their lips met. It was a hesitant kiss at first, then deep and full of a silent, binding promise. A promise of a home, of a love that had been born from convenience and desperation, but which had now, in this moment of shared vulnerability, bloomed into something real, something beautiful, something true. It was the hope of a future that transcended the pain of the past, a future where the woman who had once offered everything for a roof over her head had finally gained everything she had never dared to dream of: love, acceptance, and a place to truly, finally, call home. This was their point of no return. The world outside, with its judgments and its prejudices, no longer mattered. All that mattered was this, the two of them, kneeling on the floor of the quiet, waiting house, their hearts finally, completely, open to each other. The seasons turned, and the Granite Peak Ranch, once a monument to a frozen past, began to thaw. The house, which had been a silent, echoing shell, was now filled with the quiet, steady hum of a shared life. Isaac and Annaba's love, forged in the crucible of a desperate bargain and a shared vulnerability, became the new foundation of the home. It was a love that was not spoken in grand declarations, but in small, everyday acts of care and devotion. It was in the way he would leave a wildflower on her pillow in the morning, a silent testament to the beauty she had brought back into his life. It was in the way she would mend the worn collar of his shirt, her nimble fingers a gentle, caressing touch. They were two solitary souls who had found in each other a quiet harbor, a safe haven from the storms of their pasts. The town of Redemption Gulch, with its whispers and its judgments, faded into a distant, irrelevant murmur. Their world was here, on this isolated stretch of land, a world they were building together, one day, one shared glance, one quiet touch at a time. Their love, once a secret, fragile thing, now demanded to be seen, to be acknowledged. They rode into town together, not as master and servant, but as partners, their hands clasped, their heads held high. They faced the stares, the whispers, the cold, disapproving glances, not with defiance, but with a quiet, unshakable confidence in the truth of their love. They were a testament to a different kind of law, a law of the heart that transcended the petty, man-made rules of prejudice and fear. And slowly, miraculously, the town began to change. The baker's wife, who had once looked at Annabelle with suspicion, now offered her a warm, shy smile. The blacksmith, who had once muttered under his breath about the savage at the Thorn Ranch, now tipped his hat in a gesture of grudging respect. Their love, in its quiet, unassuming power, was a force of nature, a gentle rain that was slowly, patiently, washing away the dust of the town's ingrained prejudices. The news of a child on the way was a quiet, sacred thing, a secret they kept between themselves for as long as they could. It was a promise of a future they had never dared to imagine, a future that would be a living, breathing testament to their love. The child, a son with his father's quiet strength and his mother's fierce, resilient spirit, was born in the same room where Isaac's first wife had died, a room that had once been a place of sorrow, but which was now a place of new beginnings. The birth was not just the arrival of a new life. It was the final, definitive act of healing. The ghosts of the past had not been banished, but they had made room, had stepped aside to welcome the future. The house was no longer a mausoleum of memories. It was a home, filled with the sounds of a baby's cry, of a mother's soft lullaby, of a father's deep, contented sigh. The arrival of the child was a bridge, not just between Isaac and Annabelle, but between their two worlds. Annabelle's mother, who had thought her daughter lost forever, came down from the tribal lands, her face a mask of disbelief and a dawning, wondrous joy. She brought with her gifts, blessings, and the tentative, fragile promise of a reconciliation. Isaac's sister-in-law, who had once been the voice of the town's condemnation, came to the ranch, not with accusations, but with a peace offering, a handmade quilt for the baby, a silent admission of her own foolish, misguided pride. The child, a symbol of a love that had defied all boundaries, became a catalyst for a new kind of understanding, a new kind of community. The Granite Peak Ranch, once a symbol of isolation, of a man cut off from the world, was now a meeting place, a crossroads, a place where two cultures, two families, two histories could come together, not in conflict, but in a shared celebration of a love that had proven stronger than all their differences. If you believe that love has the power to heal not just individuals, but entire communities, that it can build bridges where once there were only walls, please share this video. Let's celebrate the quiet, unassuming power of a love that dares to defy the world. 10 years passed. The Granite Peak Ranch thrived, its fields green and fertile, its herds fat and healthy. The house, once a stark, silent monument to grief, was now a warm, bustling home, its walls echoing with the sounds of children's laughter. Isaac and Annabelle's son, a boy with his father's quiet strength and his mother's fierce, resilient spirit, was joined by a daughter, a girl with her mother's dark, luminous eyes and her father's gentle, compassionate heart. The ranch was no longer a fortress against the world, but a sanctuary, a place of welcome and refuge for all who sought it. The Sunstone clan, a nomadic community of outcasts, had made the valley their seasonal home, their vibrant, colorful camp a welcome sight on the horizon. The town of Redemption Gulch, its old prejudices softened by the undeniable truth of Isaac and Annabelle's love, had become a true community, a place where differences were not just tolerated, but celebrated. Isaac Thorne, the man who had been as cold and as hard as the granite peaks that gave his ranch its name, was now a man transformed. The lines on his face were no longer etched with grief, but with the quiet, contented joy of a man who had found his purpose, his peace, his home. Annaba, the woman who had been a hunted, desperate fugitive, was now the respected matriarch of a sprawling, unconventional family, her quiet strength and gentle wisdom a guiding light for all who knew her. Their love story became a legend in the territory, a tale told and retold around campfires and in the parlors of the town. It was a story of a love that had been born from a desperate bargain, a love that had defied all boundaries, a love that had healed not just two broken souls, but an entire community. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, Isaac and Annaba sat on their porch, their children playing in the yard, their grandchildren chasing fireflies in the twilight. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers, a familiar, comforting gesture that spoke of a lifetime of shared love. "Do you remember that first night?" he asked, his voice a low, soft rumble. "The storm? The fear? The desperate, foolish bargain?" She smiled, her eyes shining in the soft, fading light. "I remember a man who opened his door to a stranger," she said. "A man who chose kindness when the world had shown me only cruelty. A man who saw not a savage, not a burden, but a woman in need of a home." He looked at her, at the woman who had brought him back to life, who had filled the empty spaces of his heart with a love so profound, so unexpected, that it had reshaped his entire world. What is the true measure of a man's life? Is it in the wealth he accumulates, the land he tames, the name he makes for himself? Or is it in the quiet, unseen moments of love and sacrifice, in the legacy of compassion that he leaves behind? Isaac Thorne had built an empire of cattle and land, but his true legacy was not in the vast expanse of his ranch, but in the small, warm circle of the family he had built, a family forged not in blood, but in the crucible of a shared, improbable, and profoundly beautiful love. If this story has reminded you of the power of a love that dares to defy the world, a love that builds bridges and heals wounds, then subscribe to Mr. Storytelling. For in these stories, we find the best of who we are and who we can be.